In our episodes, we discuss cases and topics that might be distressing or disturbing to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome back, friends, to another episode of Cardinal Crimes. If you are new, my name is Becca. I am a former intelligence analyst, and I research mostly Iowa cold cases in my spare time. Now, last week we had part one covering Charles Hatcher, a serial killer from Missouri. We talked about his upbringing, early criminal history, and his activity in 1969. Our ultimate goal was to figure out if he could have been responsible for the 1969 murder of Dorothy Miller in Burlington, Iowa. I had a pretty flimsy theory that he was responsible based on aliases he had used, his history of being in Iowa, and a striking resemblance to the sketch of the suspect in Dorothy's case. But long story short, he couldn't have been responsible for Dorothy's murder. But we are not done with Charles Hatcher's story. So let's continue. We left off in the last episode with Hatcher escaping a prison in Kansas on August 21st, 1969, and making his way to California, where 9 years before he would murder Eric Christgen, he would assault a 5-year-old boy. On August 29th, 1969, Charles Hatcher had coaxed a boy to come with him by offering him ice cream. Luckily, this boy survives, but the horror that Hatcher inflicted on him is just unimaginable. Hatcher beat and sexually assaulted this boy repeatedly until a man walking his dog saw Hatcher assaulting the boy in a vacant lot. The man ran and called police, and luckily they arrived in time where Hatcher was still assaulting the boy. Police said the boy was covered in blood. He had been horrifically beaten and assaulted. They arrested Hatcher, who wouldn't speak except to say that his name was Albert Price. And for the next 9 years, Hatcher would be in California hospitals, courtrooms, and prisons. He would be sent to hospitals for treatment and to be evaluated for his competency to stand trial, and that went back and forth between him being ruled competent and incompetent, sane, insane. He was eventually tried and found guilty of the assault on the boy. Then, over the course of multiple years, the back and forth turned into whether or not he should be paroled. Now, it's hard to understand, after such a brutal attack on a boy, how Hatcher was ever let out and back into society. One doctor who evaluated Hatcher wrote a letter to the court reading, "This report is to inform the judge that, in my opinion, this man is still a mentally disordered sex offender, has not recovered, and remains a danger to society and should not be given a new opportunity to victimize others. He has not benefited from therapy and should be returned to court for resumption of criminal proceedings. He is antisocial, has severe sexual deviation, and aggressive sexuality. He is extremely sociopathic and a dangerous person. His offense is a rather brutal sexual assault on a 5-year-old boy. This appears to be an isolated incident and an extremely sociopathic and dangerous person. It is the staff's opinion that this man is unalienable to the treatment programs here and that he remains dangerous and is an extreme escape risk." Now, despite this doctor's note, and I think the very clear communication in there that Hatcher is a dangerous man, despite that, and based on I don't know what, a combination of maybe Hatcher manipulating doctors, miscommunication, poor judgment, I don't know. But he was let out and sent to a halfway house. He very quickly violated the terms of his parole and fled. He made his way to Minnesota, where he was arrested and let go. He then went back to St. Joseph, Missouri. Today, we are going to discuss the murder of Eric Christgen. Let's get started. Karen Carter had quite a few jobs. She worked as a wood inspector, but sometimes cleaned offices at Walnut Products Co., an office owned by Ed Christgen in St. Joseph, Missouri. The Christgens were a well-known family in the area, and in addition to her inspector and cleaning duties, she would also help watch Eric Christgen, Edwin's 4-year-old son, when he brought him into the office. On Friday, May 26, 1978, Karen and a coworker named Kathy took Eric to eat lunch at Long John Silver's. Afterwards, Eric spoke with his mother, Vicky, on the phone. According to Terry Gainey's book, Innocent Blood, she asked if Eric was ready to come home, and he said no, he was having too much fun with Karen. Karen and Eric spent the next few hours driving around town and running errands. Just before 3 p.m., Karen and Eric stopped to go to a store called Mantrix. Memorial Day weekend was coming up, and Ed had asked Karen to buy an American flag for them to display. Karen and Eric were walking up to the store when Eric said he wanted to stay outside and play on a slide that was just right outside of the shop. Karen said as she walked into the store, she saw Eric run to the slide and climb up the ladder. Karen walks to the back of the store, grabs a flag, pays for it, and leaves. Now, she was only in the store for a matter of minutes, but when she gets outside, Eric is no longer at the slide. Chapter 1 of Terry Gainey's book details the panic Karen was in, searching the now deserted park, stores up and down the block, asking employees and customers if they had seen the little blonde 4-year-old boy. No one had. Karen called the St. Joseph Police Department and reported him missing, and the response was immediate. Everyone in town, including the police department, knew the Christgen family. They were wealthy and well off, and while I'm sure there would be official denial that this is why they took it so serious right from the beginning, that is certainly what Terry's book is alleging. Within hours, the entire police department was on the search. The Christgen family had pulled together their resources and amassed more volunteers for a ground search. They had men on foot, in vehicles, motorcycles, horseback, in boats. They had a plane circling overhead. Everyone was looking for Eric. Joining the search was Joe Holtzlag, an FBI agent assigned to St. Joseph. Holtzlag becomes a big part of the overall story of Charles Hatcher, but initially in the investigation into Eric Christgen's disappearance, he offered himself up as just an additional hand to local police. Hour after hour, there was no sign of the boy, and by 3 a.m., almost 12 hours of nonstop searching, the search was called off for the night. They agreed to meet again at 7 the next morning to continue. Pretty quickly, police had suspicions that Eric had been kidnapped. I don't know exactly what that was based on. It was perhaps because of the wealth of the Christgen family. In fact, almost immediately, Edwin Christgen went on local TV and announced that he would pay $10,000 for information leading to the safe return of Eric. Police also wondered and were kind of waiting for the point that they thought they might receive a ransom call. The next day, Saturday, May 27th, 1978, over 200 people gathered to continue the search for Eric, and police began following up on calls from people they believed had seen the boy. One man, a plumber in the area, said he had seen a blonde boy and an older man around 3:30 p.m. on Friday walking along some railroad tracks near the Missouri River. The search team shifted their focus to that area, which presented some challenges. The terrain, for one, made the search very difficult. Parts of the areas they searched were extremely dense with forest. And secondly, a massive rainstorm had come through. All of the searchers were trudging through the mud and through the downpour. But despite this, the search continued. And then, between 6:30 and 7 p.m. on that second day of searching, a discovery was made. A searcher had been making his way through the dense woods, having to kind of make his own trail in the thick brush, until he stumbled upon an area where it looked like a path had already been formed. He stepped down the trail and found little Eric. Terry Gainey's book reads, quote, "In the fading twilight, he first saw the boy's red and blue striped shirt, then the lifeless body lying on a stone ledge. Just beside him, like a toy that slips from the hands of a sleepy child, rested a bird's nest. It was filled with eggs as blue as Eric's eyes." Eric's body was found just a 20-minute walk from the slide he had been playing at. Agent Holtzlag had been leading a mobile command post at the Christgen home when he received word that Eric's body had been found. Holtzlag was asked to come to the scene to help. Apparently, the scene itself was almost immediately contaminated by press. People walking around in the mud, taking photos, walking over any footprints that might have been found. But Holtzlag's part was done. He was a federal agent, and he didn't want to dictate how the state's investigation would go. He did, however, have one final job, and that was to tell Edwin and Vicky Christgen that their son was dead. Word was spreading quickly throughout town, and he didn't want Eric's parents finding out from the media. He said telling them was the hardest thing he had ever done. Now, I'll say this for every case, that I can't imagine what parents go through in a situation like this, but in reading about this case, the hell that his parents must have gone through is just on another level. The scene was entirely contaminated, like I said, by the press and police's inability to secure it. But the very next day, on Sunday, May 28th, 1978, the St. Joseph News Press published a story on Eric's body being found with a photo of his body. A huge photo on the front page of the newspaper. Now, you can't see his face in the photo, but you can see his entire body lying in the brush, his pants are unbuttoned, and the public, according to Terry Gainey's book, was rightfully outraged at the paper's use of the photo, and they were also frightened at the news that Eric had been murdered. An autopsy was performed, and it was determined that Eric had been sexually assaulted and had been asphyxiated. The investigation went on. Tips came in, and the plumber who said he saw the boy and an older man was put under investigative hypnosis to try and gather more details. Renowned FBI profiler Roy Hazelwood with the then called Behavioral Science Unit was called in to provide a profile of the offender based on the crime scene, witness statements, autopsy reports, and more. I am going to read some portions of Hazelwood's profile, which is written in full in Terry Gainey's book, which, again, I am using as one of my primary sources for research on Charles Hatcher. I will link this book in the show notes if you're interested in reading it. It is a very well-written book and very thorough. So parts of Hazelwood's profile read, quote, "Based on the information and the pictures we have available to us, we feel that this was a crime of opportunity as opposed to some type of planned situation. We feel that you are probably looking for a pedophile, a lover of children, white. We feel that he's probably living alone, is unmarried, and is from a lower income background with a poor education. And if he is employed in a menial type of occupation. The time and occurrence, or at least the abduction, would tend to indicate that he probably was not employed on that day or was employed in shift work. We feel there is a record of this individual for some form of child molestation or homosexual activity either locally or in departments in the surrounding 100 to 200 miles. We also feel that he has committed offenses at least where he would attempt to abduct a child or have relations with a younger boy on numerous occasions in the past. The method and extent of the attack leave us with the opinion that he may well have a homosexual orientation, with obviously a preference for young boys. However, he may have been dealing with older boys in the past and over the years has been unable to attract the older homosexual child and has had to resort to the younger boys. He probably lives or works in the general vicinity of where the boy was taken." The profile goes on to say that because of the time of day of the abduction, there normally weren't children in the mall area at that time. So they believed that the offender had another reason to be there and wasn't there simply waiting on a child to appear. The profile says, "Of importance is the fact that this, or most of these people are, repeat offenders. There is no reason to think that this man will not repeat this crime again. Whether he kills the next one or not is debatable, but we have been discussing this, and we would offer a prediction that he would repeat again by October or November of this year, since they usually will repeat within 6 months of the previous occurrence. Because this death may well have been accidental would indicate the possibility that he has, of course, attacked children in the past and not killed them, and that they are around with the knowledge of his face and description." The profile says the man is likely a loner, will be reported as a man acting strange around places where children congregate, he won't be a big talker, and that they might feel inadequate to the idea of approaching a mature woman or, if homosexual, a mature man. So in their inadequacy, they approach a boy or a child. They said it's unlikely the offender would leave town as a result of the killing, that this type of offender wouldn't normally run from town to town as a result of the crimes. They said he would have considerable guilt over what happened and, if interviewed, would confess if approached in a considerate manner. The profile also says that based on the location of the body, the offender would likely be physically capable, as it would take considerable effort to get to where the body was discovered. So, considering what we know about Hatcher's upbringing and some of his previous crimes, like attempting to abduct a 16-year-old paperboy, which we talked about in the last episode, and his crimes in California that we talked about at the beginning of this one, the profile was very accurate. Even the part about him feeling guilt and confessing will come to prove very spot on, and we will get into that in the next episode. The investigation, though, never turned up Hatcher. I could spend hours on Eric's murder investigation alone, but there were just many, many problems and roadblocks. There was the crime scene contamination, the intense public scrutiny of the case, and a lack of tips that brought them closer to a viable suspect. One suspect, though, included a 64-year-old man named Harry Fox. He was brought to police's attention because a tip came in that this man had been seen in the company of a child in an office building near where Eric had been abducted. Now, the building was where Fox worked, and he had worked there for 23 years. He worked there as an elevator operator and previously as a janitor. Now, he did work on a later shift. He was never married, he lived alone and kept to himself. But physically, one of the main investigators knew he couldn't have been responsible. Harry Fox had considerable trouble walking. He had to walk up hills backwards because he couldn't lift his feet properly. But despite that, they interrogated him twice, leaving him in tears, drooling, and sobbing. And on the second interrogation, he was so frantic that this man died during the interrogation. He was in such a state of panic over the interrogation that he started convulsing and had a heart attack. Now, the problems in the investigation continued when another lead was followed up on. Someone had submitted a tip that a man by the name of Melvin Reynolds was seen near the mall the day Eric was kidnapped and murdered. Now, Reynolds was known to law enforcement for minor crimes like petty theft, but also because he was considered at the time to just be a strange man. He wore dresses and carried a purse around, which stuck in the minds of officers more than his petty crimes did. But he was also known for troubles he had growing up. He came from a family where he saw his mother abused by his father. He had illnesses and troubles in school. He would also often get into trouble when he was younger for making sexually explicit jokes or otherwise sexually harassing people. And eventually, his mother couldn't take it and sent him to a boys' home when he was 10 years old. Now, for 2 years at this boys' home, Reynolds said he was repeatedly sexually abused by the older boys in the school. And by the time he switched schools at 12 years old, he was sexually confused by the experience. He went from job to job as he got older and was diagnosed as exhibiting signs of mental retardation and antisocial behavior. But Melvin was working with a psychologist on improving his social relationships, and he eventually met a woman named Rita, and they planned on getting married. But Reynolds got on investigators' radar, and they were convinced he was responsible for Eric Christgen's murder. This was despite him being only 25 years old, much younger than the couple of witnesses who said they saw Eric with an older man. Melvin Reynolds, too, wasn't a very strong guy. He was 5'8" and 145 pounds, far off from the heavier set man described by those witnesses and the physically capable offender in the Hazelwood profile. But alas, Reynolds was brought in for an interrogation that lasted 2 hours. By the end of the interrogation, Gainey describes Reynolds as tired and shaking and terrified and shocked by photos of Eric's body and the tone of the officer interrogating him. After the 2-hour interrogation, they asked him if he'd be willing to take a polygraph. Reynolds said yes. The polygraph lasted for 4 more hours. They asked him hundreds of personal questions about his sex life, his family, his work, his involvement in Eric's murder. The book says Lieutenant Boyer asked, quote, "Melvin, were you on the mall that day?" Melvin said no. Boyer asked, "Did you kill the boy?" Melvin said no, but paused and said, quote, "But I'll say so if you want me to." Now, initially, there were some doubts that Reynolds was responsible. They believed him when he said he didn't kill Eric, and they thought that he would say anything to please the officers, which, yes, clearly based on him saying, "But I'll say so if you want me to." I think many do not understand the concept of a false confession. It's hard to comprehend why someone would confess to something they didn't do, especially the heinous murder of a child. But it happens. High pressure and long interrogations can break people down, especially when you combine that with intimidation, promises of leniency, and deception. Don't forget that police are allowed to lie to you, and they absolutely will. They can say that they have evidence against you, even if they don't. Then, if you have a vulnerable individual, like a minor, someone with cognitive impairments, or someone who is stressed and exhausted, they are particularly susceptible to falsely confessing. This is why interrogation techniques are so important. And police to this day are known to still use techniques that contribute to false confessions. And despite those initial thoughts from investigators that maybe Melvin wasn't their guy, they continued to bring him in for questioning. They questioned him 9 times over the course of about 8 months. He'd say a little more each time. Some of his story would check out and some of it wouldn't. While investigators started to become suspicious that his lies meant he was guilty, Melvin kept wondering what he would have to say to get them to leave him alone. He was polygraphed for a second time and once again denied killing Eric, but said he would admit to it if the officer wanted him to. They continued questioning him. They hypnotized him, and in December of 1979, they brought Melvin to a hospital and gave him a truth serum. Melvin said, quote, "I didn't have anything to do with it. I saw the boy on the mall. I didn't have anything to do with it. Before I went to the unemployment office," but that was it. His misspeak and him saying, before I went to the unemployment office, that was enough. Melvin was brought in once again for an interrogation that Terry Gainey's book said lasted from 10:30 in the morning until 1 in the morning the next day. There was a prosecutor called in because Melvin was now consistently admitting he was responsible. But even the prosecutor was worried that Melvin was just saying what they wanted to hear. But investigators were ready for the case to be done. They, in fact, wanted to call a press conference right then and there and announce that it had been solved. What they put Melvin through and the clear signs that he was willing to say and do anything to stop the questions is just so sad. Terry Gainey's book goes into so much more detail about this. I highly recommend you read it. And again, I'll have that linked in the description. But basically, the prosecutor, even though he was not fully convinced, was getting pressure from investigators to charge Melvin with murder. And so he did. Hours later, the police chief held a press conference announcing they had filed charges and they had 100% confidence and agreement with him. But Bob Eaton, one of the officers who led the search for Eric following his disappearance, was shocked at the charges being filed. He went to the police chief's home and said he didn't think they had the right guy, that Melvin Reynolds couldn't be responsible. He didn't match the description at all. But the police chief, Chief Hayes, who will come up again in our next episode, essentially told this officer to get lost. He didn't care, and the next day, Hayes brought this guy in and berated him for going to his house off duty to, quote, argue with him. Eaton was left so rattled about the situation that he left the police force 6 months later. Eaton, though, wasn't the only one who didn't believe Melvin was the guy. The polygrapher, Lieutenant Boyer, also didn't think so, and Agent Holtzlag, who hadn't been working on the case in a while, but when he learned about Melvin's confession and read about him, was surprised. Additionally, a woman came forward and said that she spoke to Melvin on the front porch of his home at 3:25 p.m. the day Eric was abducted. She essentially had an alibi for Melvin, but police wouldn't comment on it. The day after Melvin was charged, he confessed to Kansas authorities to killing another 4-year-old boy named Christopher Chapin. Kansas agents said there were too many inconsistencies in what Reynolds was saying for him to have been responsible. Now, the charges were reviewed by a grand jury, and on March 7th, they indicted Melvin on charges of second-degree felony murder. Melvin's family was devastated by this news, but they never wavered in their belief that he was innocent. As news of Melvin's arrest and murder charges spread throughout town, Melvin's family had to move as people began throwing bricks through windows and vandalizing the home. Melvin's family pooled their resources and hired a defense attorney named Lee Nation. Melvin's trial began on Tuesday, October 9th, 1979, and to say the jury was tainted would be an understatement. This was already a town where everyone seemed to know everyone, and that was certainly the case for the jurors. Most of them knew each other, some of them knew Melvin, some of them knew the Christians, knew the prosecutor, and the prosecutor's name was Insco, and he comes up a lot in this case. During jury selection, all 50 potential jurors said they knew about this case from newspapers. The newspapers, which had, since Melvin was arrested, posted in-depth reviews of him and his life. Gainey's book said one juror outright said that the St. Joseph newspapers had already convicted Reynolds. Now, despite Lee Nation seeming extremely confident in court proceedings, when it came time to give opening statements, he apparently didn't have one. Insco went on with his case, told the jury what they planned to prove, but Nation just didn't have an opening argument at all, which is stunning to me. I mean, I've worked for a time in a public defender's office, but I am not a lawyer. So if there's any lawyers out there, is this normal? Can you just not have an opening statement? That seems crazy to me. But the prosecution brought up witnesses. They brought up photos of the scene, Eric's body for the jurors. They walked through the autopsy results. And when Sergeant Bob Anderson took the stand to testify about Reynolds' confession, Nation then objected. He told the judge that Reynolds had been under near constant harassment by police in the weeks before his confession, and that a lawyer hadn't been present, and that there wasn't an intelligent waiver of the defendant's rights. The judge dismissed the jury for the rest of the afternoon to hear first what the testimony of Anderson would be. The judge asked Anderson what led them to investigate Reynolds. Now, I had said previously that there was a tip that said Melvin was in the area where Christgen was abducted, but on the stand, Anderson said, quote, "I heard he molested his nephew." And remember when I said that Melvin was known to police for his petty crimes, but for also being what they just consider to be a strange guy? Well, this rumor was also something talked about among police officers. The rumor originated when his nephew one night told his parents, excuse my language here, be prepared for some profanity. Melvin's nephew told his parents, quote, "Melvin said, 'Suck my cock.'" And now, this would obviously be concerning, right? But it was later learned that the nephew and Melvin were walking down the street when a truck drove by, and the guy driving the truck was yelling at them, and Melvin, in turn, yelled to the driver, "Suck my cock." So you could see, obviously, how that would be completely taken out of context and sound horrible. But the damage had been done. The rumor was swirling around the neighborhood and ended up with law enforcement. The judge asked about the nature of Melvin's confession. Anderson talked about how Melvin pointed out the exact location of the murder, but admitted under cross-examination by Nation that he could have seen photos of the location in local newspapers. But after back and forth, the judge said that the jury could hear Anderson's testimony and the confessions. Now, the jury heard the confessions, but not all of them. The prosecution didn't play the initial confessions where there were inconsistencies in Melvin's story. They played later confessions where his story was more consistent with what had happened. And it seems like they never played the confessions where he said, and I'll confess to it if you want me to. So that's all they played, were the more consistent confessions. And now, the prosecution rests its case. And in Terry Gainey's book, it is clear that there were many who doubted the case against Melvin. And I've talked about some of the people who doubted it before, but even some of the deputy prosecutors who worked on the case were wary. They could clearly see that even though the confessions presented to the jury were compelling, when you put those confessions in with the entire context of Melvin's interrogation, his other confessions, and other evidence, the case against him just wasn't that great. It was clear that Melvin was very susceptible to incorporating suggestions from police into his confessions, and just like Melvin had said, he would say what they wanted him to say. And to me, an outsider, I'm not a lawyer, once again, I can see that there's a good case for the defense to present. They could, for one, play the other confessions and show the inconsistencies in what Melvin was saying. They could show how he literally says, "I'll confess if you want me to." There were the eyewitness accounts of the boy walking with an old man, not the 25-year-old Melvin was at the time of the murder. And there's testimony from the woman who said she spoke to Melvin on the day of the murder at a time that would make it impossible for him to have committed it. But Melvin's defense attorney, Lee Nation, only called 3 witnesses. The defense testimony only lasted 40 minutes. They called Lieutenant Boyer, who testified about how Melvin had denied killing Eric during the polygraph, but offered to admit it. But the prosecutor was able to turn it on Melvin again during cross-examination and objected to the results of the polygraph being admitted, which the results weren't admissible in court anyway, but now the jury wouldn't know that Melvin had passed his polygraphs and would likely assume that he failed them. A friend of Melvin's was called and testified that she had seen Melvin the night Eric was missing and everyone was searching for him and that Melvin was unaware of the crime. And Nation called Melvin to the stand. His testimony was short, and in it he said that he didn't kill Eric, that he only confessed because he was scared of police. On cross-examination, the prosecutor asked if police had beaten or threatened him. Melvin said no. The defense rested their case. Lee Nation didn't call either of the witnesses who said they saw an old man walking with Eric, and he didn't call the witness who had an alibi for Melvin. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. They found Melvin Reynolds guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison on October 12th, 1979. The town of St. Joseph, Missouri, was relieved. They believed a sadistic killer had been caught and was now behind bars. There were some who celebrated, but there were also those who had their doubts about Melvin's guilt, but they didn't speak up. They were afraid of backlash. After Melvin's sentencing, where he continued to say he was innocent, a reporter said, quote, "If I were you, I'd be pretty upset about being sentenced for something I didn't do." Melvin said, quote, "I am, but what can I do about it? There's not a damn thing I can do about it right now. What really bothers me is that whoever did it, they're still out on the streets laughing about it." Now, we know that Melvin Reynolds didn't kill Eric Christgen. Charles Hatcher did. So what was Charles Hatcher doing during this time? What was he doing while Melvin was in prison, where he was subjected to brutal beatings and rapes by other inmates? We will get into that in the next episode, where we discuss the murder of another child in St. Joseph, how Charles Hatcher was finally caught, and what he revealed to agents. And what did this mean for Melvin Reynolds? Thank you so much for listening. We will see you next week. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cardinal Crimes. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing, giving us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast, and sharing this episode with others. You can find us on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram with the handle @CardinalCrimes, and you can send us any case suggestions, questions, or topics you would like covered there or to our email, cardinalcrimes@gmail.com. Until next time, friends, take care of each other and take care of yourself. If you've ever thought about starting your own podcast, there's no better place to begin than with Buzzsprout. It's the platform I use, and it makes publishing, promoting, and tracking your episodes so easy, even if you're not tech savvy. Plus, they help you get listed in all the major directories like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and more. And here's the best part. When you sign up for a paid Buzzsprout plan using my affiliate link, you'll get $20 off and you'll be supporting the show at the same time. Just head to the description of this episode to find the affiliate link. Now, let's get back to the episode.